Hello, friends. I'm going to talk about the Jam today. What a great band. If you've never heard the Jam or gotten into the deep cuts, you should. There's, everybody knows A Town Called Malice and their hits and the ones that have been played a lot. But they've got so many songs on, all of their albums that are just fantastic. They are an energetic guitar and bass, guitar, bass, and drums. They're a three-piece. They're one of those classic three-piece bands. And when you have a three-piece, I played in three-piece bands when I was in my band days, and one of the philosophies of such an arrangement is that the guitar player has to sort of play more to fill in the gaps of not having a second guitar player, and the bass player has to play more to fill in the gaps of not having a second guitar player to fill in the gaps. So the bass player tends to be a little bit more upfront a lot of times, or more of a lead instrument or a co-lead instrument. And the guitar player tends to be also like a rhythm and lead player, which is interesting because when you see a lot of times on the recording they'll do overdubs, but when you see them live, if they're not using tapes or whatever, whenever the guitar player goes from rhythm guitar into playing a lead, the bass player sometimes will, sometimes in certain bands, will play chords or play more notes to kind of fill it in while the guitar player is playing a solo. Because while a guitar player in a three-piece band is playing a guitar solo, there's suddenly no rhythm guitar player because he's busy playing a solo right now. So the bass player has to kind of fill in. And with the Jam, the bass player in the Jam, Bruce Foxton, is a fantastic bass player. He's just like one of the best of the sort of post-punk. They got called punk, but I never really saw them as punk. They had a bit of an attitude, but I always thought they were mods. They seem more, tie-wearing mods. A little bit, to me, they seemed more related to The Who, and some people say, well, The Who were the first punk rock band, and I'm like, I don't know. They were, but the Jam was a pop band. They were like a pure pop band, but they were like a energetic, kind of angsty pop band. Paul Weller, singer, guitar player, main songwriter. Bruce Foxton also wrote songs, but Paul Weller had an attitude. He wasn't he didn't really seem like a very happy guy in the Jam. He was always kind of upset about something, and a little bit of anger coming through, and sometimes a lot of anger coming through in the way he played his guitar. There was he often didn't play pretty parts on his guitar. He was playing an extension of his angst through the strings of his guitar, and you expect him to just be breaking strings like crazy. But they were so so fun and so full of energy. I mean, if you search online for photographs of the Jam playing live, a lot of times you'll see the bass player Bruce Foxton with a somewhat heavy bass guitar, much like that one right there, a Rickenbacker 4001, same color even. I may or may not have bought that bass because of him, but you'll see pictures of him with that somewhat heavy bass, like levitating. You'll like jumping off the drum riser, and looks like he's 10 feet in the air. And they just had so much energy coming off the stage, coming off the albums that they did. They did some really great early records. Their early stuff. Pretty much all their stuff is worth listening to. This one is all mod cons, which is sort of a real estate term and not a description of how they deal with people. They're not con men or anything like that. It's a great album. This one has got some great sort of like David Watts and Mr. Clean, but there's a type of pop on here that I think Elvis Costello was into as well, that was happening which is kind of inspired, I think, by things like Motown. A lot of earlier bands, like bands in the '60s, you talk to you talk to people like the Beatles, Rolling Stones, they're going to say that they were inspired by the blues and blues type people. But with the Jam and Elvis Costello, I think they were inspired by, the Beatles and perhaps the Beach Boys. But they, I think, were also inspired a bit by Motown because there's a lot of that groove on this, on mostly on the later Jam albums. But bands like that around that time were sort of exploring those kind of things, like the tambourine, like when you put the tambourine on the hi-hat so that the tambourine is shaking along with the hi-hat opening and closing, and that sound and like hitting the tambourine, that kind of has this Motown thing and that sort of in the pocket groove with the drums, along with this sort of British angsty pop and that kind of Rickenbacker jangly but distorted. I think he was playing a Rickenbacker through a Vox amp, which is like the classic configuration, to get that British sound, which I think he was going for because he loved the Beatles, like the way John Lennon's guitar distorted. And I think a lot of bands in that around that time were still being majorly influenced by the Beatles. And there's an album that came out in 1980. I think it's their fifth album called Sound Effects that I think is perhaps my favorite Jam album. And I remember when this one came out thinking it was just like this was their Sgt. Pepper. This was their big one. And it turns out that there's a bunch of things on here that actually sound like the Beatles. There's I remember also thinking, wow, these guys they really like the Beatles. There's a, Start on here. The song Start has a bass line that basically sounds like the Taxman, maybe a little different, but it's an homage. I'm not saying that they ripped off the Beatles because it's like nobody's going to not hear that. You know what I mean? Because the Beatles aren't some obscure band that they were saying, oh, let's rip off that bass line. Nobody will ever know. They were doing it, I think, as an homage to the Beatles. They loved the Beatles and the sort of Britishness of this album, and really all of the Jam albums kind of is a bit like some of the moments in the Beatles albums and some of the more British invasion type bands that were doing music that was grounded in their upbringing, in their country. And the Jam was definitely doing songs about their own experience in their own country. They weren't trying to project themselves into Americana or the blues or that kind of thing. They were doing this sort of city, down in the streets kind of groovy city music, kind of inspired a little bit by some American things like Motown, and but soul music, that kind of soul vibe, which is so great. There's a song on here that I remember when this album came out was a huge hit among pals of mine who are into music, because the Jam were really guitar, drums, and bass kind of band, but then they sort of experimented with horns and things like that. This album has this has got a sitar on it in there somewhere and some backwards guitars and things like that. But it's got horns, and there's an acoustic song on here, which at the time was kind of like, well, that's interesting. That's kind of a new thing for Paul Weller. The song called That's Entertainment, which is a classic Jam song, perhaps one of my favorite Jam songs if I'm gonna make a list of favorites, which I hate. But That's Entertainment is an epic song. It's basically like a painting of daily life, like a moment in time kind of a song where it's talking about just things that happened and in that he observes in his world, in his town, and the chorus basically just says all those things are entertainment. That's entertainment. Here's something that I saw happening. That's entertainment. And it's an interesting idea. I mean, an interesting conceptually to take it that way, to sort of realize that everyday life is fascinating to you and entertaining. And I think he really loves his culture, the place where he grew up, and the things that inspired him when he was young, and the neighborhoods and the people of London and England, and that's what I really love about that album. It's just a fantastic album. All the songs on it are great. All the songs on all the Jam albums are pretty great. And Paul Weller went more into the soul thing when he got out of the Jam and was doing the Style Council and some other things. His solo albums, very classy kind of soul jams that are just groovy and with the horns and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's me looking at a couple of the Jam albums. A band that is worth getting into and exploring if you're not already, way into them. Give them a listen. I think you'll like the Jam. But thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again real soon.